Let's bring in our panel here in our studio. Monica de Bolle is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Also with us, Liliana Sousa is an economist at the Poverty Global Practice at the World Bank. From Rio de Janeiro, Marcelo Ner is the former Brazilian Minister of Strategic Affairs and author of the book The New Middle Class. And Gilson Schwartz is a professor of economics at the University of Sao Paulo. He joins us from London. Welcome to all of you. Marcelo Ner, let me start with you. You have worked in government. You've written extensively about the program, Bolsa Familia. What is your assessment of it?
The program is really well targeted, cover 25% of the Brazilian population, costs only 0.4% of GDP, and it has conditionalities. It's a good program. It was built over some similar work from Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and this program has been decaying in the last 5 years, not something of this last year. So the percentage of extreme poverty in Brazil using the $1.25 a day rose 67% from 2014 to 2018, because the program, the size of the benefits has been falling, and this year the number of beneficiaries of Bolsa Familia has dropped. So we lost 1 million people. Now there is 1 million people in the line of the program that shouldn't be there. So it's a good program, but it's shrinking, at least in these last 5 years, but maybe it will come back soon.
And Marcelo, in the time that the program was implemented, what did it do to close the inequality gap?
Inequality in Brazil, as everyone knows, is and was even higher. Since the program started, the first version in 2001, inequality fell every single year until 2014. This is something rare in Brazilian statistics, never happened before. And since the program has been shrinking, extreme poverty and inequality, but inequality is not only due to that, but extreme poverty has been on the rise. So I think if you look at the series, if you look at the history of the program, you can extract a direct correlation, and many studies can come to the same conclusion. You know, it's a very good cost benefit for the Brazilian people, and besides fighting poverty, fighting the worst kind of inequality, it also makes the wheels of the Brazilian economy goes around. So each real you spend in Bolsa Familia, you have 3 times bigger impact on GDP than, for example, Social Security benefits. So it's really a new poverty technology that has been devised in Brazil and other Latin American countries. And now it has been used, it must be said, also right, according to the political cycle in Brazil, and this is a problem. But it's a really a good technology that I think Latin America is exporting to other regions of the world.
Right. Liliana, as we've just heard, poverty and inequality very prevalent in Brazil, not just in Brazil, in other countries in South America as well. What do you make of that program?
Of the Bolsa Familia program?
Yeah.
It's an excellent program. Like Marcelo said, it's evidence-based from the beginning. It's been tested. It's been written about by not just the World Bank, academics, practitioners across the world recognize it as a very well-targeted program, like Marcelo said.
Is it very different from Social Security?
Yes, right. Especially Bolsa Familia is a conditional cash transfer, right? So in order to get it, you need to meet the income eligibility, but also you need to do special things to make sure that your children are going to school and are getting medical treatment, et cetera, right? So what it does beyond Social Security is it really invests in this sort of future human capital of the country, right, which can really sort of break the intergenerational poverty traps. And that's one of the really important things to keep in mind, as well as that it's not just poverty reduction today, it's poverty reduction in the future as well.
So people who are recipients in that program, Liliana, they have to fulfill certain requirements. How is that monitored?
So education, for example, the
Yeah.
school enrollment, there's administrative data, and they use it to check up on whether the children are actually enrolled in school, things like that. So the government has developed very good tools for making sure that these conditions are being met.
Monica, as we heard from our reporter in Brazil, the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, he's no great fan of this program. He claims he wants to clamp down on corruption and that this program is open to fraud and to corruption. How will this affect families if he clamps down? And does the government have a viable alternative?
Well, it is already affecting families right now. I mean, as we saw from what the reporter said and also from things that Marcelo said, there are many families which are currently not receiving Bolsa Familia. And on top of that, you know, those who are receiving it have seen their benefits shrink for a number of reasons, including because the program hasn't kept up with inflation. Right now, inflation in Brazil is low, but over the past few years, there have been years, especially 2015 and 2016, when inflation was very high, and the adjustments to the amounts of the program were not made. Therefore, you know, the overall benefit has shrunk. So a lot of families are suffering from the fact that, you know, this program is diminishing in size and is diminishing in importance. The president's views on the program seem somewhat misleading to me because, as Marcelo was saying, this has been a very effective program with very little cost to the budget and with a very big impact on GDP. But not just on GDP, if we're looking at it from that perspective, also a very big impact on social mobility. So for people who previously had no access to certain things, you know, this program, alongside other measures that were taken in previous governments, have allowed social mobility to actually happen in Brazil, which is a country where that particular issue had always been very, very rigid. And what does the government intend to do? It's not clear at all. They talk about clamping down on the program. They allege corruption and they allege fraud. And, you know, certainly there may be some of that, but it's not enough to just use that as an excuse to say we're going to do away with something that has worked out so well. And it's not clear at all what they're intending to put in
So
its
is it
place.
driven, the government of Bolsonaro, is he driven more by ideology?
That's my sense, yeah. He's driven completely by ideology because, of course, this is a program that was initiated not with that name, and there were several different initiatives, but back in the 90s. And then when the Workers' Party came in the 2000s, they, you know, just put all of these initiatives together under the umbrella of Bolsa Familia and enhanced it. And so it's very much been associated with previous governments, as in center-left and left government, whereas Bolsonaro, as a member of the extreme right, doesn't associate with that ideology at all.
All right, let's go to Gilson Schwartz in London. Gilson, the Brazilian economy minister, Paulo Guedes, he looks at this very differently. He says what we need to do is to cut spending and expand the economy, grow the economy, and that way people will get jobs and they wouldn't have to depend on what he calls handouts from the government. Is that viable, and will it, or could it result in even more inequality?
Well, I'm far from being a supporter of the Bolsonaro government, but I would like to add a bit of salt and pepper to the views that have been exposed so far, because as a matter of fact, even economists among the Workers' Party economists, back there in the Fernando Henrique Cardoso years, the height of the social democratic project to Brazil, they were criticizing that sort of what they call targeting policies, social policies that are designed to focus on certain aspects of poverty. This was a very, very strong, heated debate in Brazil in the 90s. We know that this kind of formula, this kind of social model, is really associated to the World Bank, and it's been criticized a lot, both from the left and from the right, because as a matter of fact, you are trying to compensate for structural inequalities. So when the Ministry of the Economy, like Paulo Guedes, he says that we need growth, I think he's right. I think that what we are seeing now is that once we get a trajectory of low growth, programs like that depend on a transference of resources by the state they just fail. They are just vulnerable to the rate of economic growth. The question is, what kind of growth? What kind of growth model? What kind of development model? And this discussion is totally out of our screens, it's out of our newspapers, out of the media, and we are now focusing again on why Bolsa Familia, why family grants are not working so well, or that the program was efficient from that very microeconomic or micro-social perspective. I think that we need to resume a macroeconomic long-term perspective. What really can be done in terms of economic development so as to include people rather than transfer resources and try to compensate some kind of moderation, you know, for the poverty and the inequality in Brazil.
Okay, Marcelo, what do you make of those suggestions?
I disagree completely. I think that I agreed with the part that Brazil has to review its model, but the part that is working, which is Bolsa Familia, which is falling inequality, in the Brazilian series, never inequality fell for so long, even labor earnings inequality as well, and poverty has fell a lot and now is rising. So I think it's, I think basically what we are doing in these last 5 years is doing a fiscal adjustment, which, by the way, Brazil needs a fiscal adjustment, but on the shoulders of the poor. I think doesn't make any sense. I think Bolsonaro did a social security reform that we have to do in Brazil. We were a latecomer in terms of social security reform, but the programs that are working and clearly, according to evaluations, not only the micro side, but the macro side shows effects. You know, you spend little, you make the wheels go around. And I think it's, I agree that the political debate is very heated. It was in the past and still today. And I don't completely dismiss and actually think that probably the current government will adopt a new program, will change Bolsa Familia. We are in the worst. Just today, the minister in charge of Bolsa Familia was substitute. So maybe that's a sign that something will come out. So we are in the low side of the low point of the crisis. But I think Bolsa Familia is a Brazilian, is a Latin American policy, very well targeted, works well, and I think we shouldn't change the things that are working. And of course, we have to change a lot of things, but Bolsa Familia is a hard thing to change because it's a good program. The risk of making it worse is not small. And the cost is very little, so I think it is really. I mean, if you look at the series, you see when you have. If you look at the studies, you do see a lot of impacts, and I think especially in this Brazilian situation today, we need more things on the quality of Bolsa Familia for education, for health, for inclusive production, and so forth.
Monica, what is your view on that, on these proposals or suggestions from the economy minister?
Well, I broadly agree with Marcelo, and I completely disagree with the previous view. The idea that you need growth first and foremost, I think, you know, as economists, we have kind of started to move beyond that idea because, of course, growth on its own doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to reduce inequality when you get it. In fact, you know, Brazil and other Latin American countries have been the chief example, and I will cite Chile as a big example of that, of countries that, you know, have had growth and yet have failed to address their issues with inequality, social mobility, poverty, and so on. I am not quite sure. I'm very skeptical as to whether the members of the current administration, I should say here that I am no supporter at all of this administration, but I do have my sincere doubts as to whether they know what they're doing when it comes to social policies and when it comes to social programs. They're, on the economic side, the minister is very intent on doing several things which, as Marcelo said before, are needed for the country, but they're basically focused on fiscal issues and on administrative reforms, tax reforms, you know, these big ticket items, which are often very hard to do. Pension reform was done. We'll see if the other reforms will be. But they are very far from this social program agenda, which the country also needs to have.
Liliana, what kind of pressure does a program like Bolsa Familia put on the economy of the country? I mean, we have Brazil, which is coming out of a recession. We have unemployment running at around 10%.
Yeah, so I wanted to go back a little bit, actually, and it doesn't have to be one or the other. Bolsa Familia and more jobs complement each other, right? The big poverty gains in the previous decade weren't just from Bolsa Familia. Big poverty gains from job improvements, especially for low-skilled workers, right? So you see an increase in wages, which really drives a lot of this poverty reduction. So there's a complementarity between growth, especially if it's inclusive, which isn't always the case, like you said, and programs like Bolsa Familia. It doesn't need to be one or the other. There's a large arsenal of tools to combat poverty, right? Absolutely. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it's Bolsa Familia is a great program, but it's not the only thing that is going to be important to reduce inequality in the long term and to reduce poverty in a country like Brazil. So I just wanted to keep that in mind. And
yeah, I would add one thing to that, which is, you know, when we speak of poverty and we speak of inequality, I mean, of course, these two issues are related, but in some sense, they're also separated. So programs that fight poverty, like Bolsa Familia, while they might address portions of, you know, the overall income distribution and therefore might affect inequality in some sense, they alone are not completely responsible for reducing inequality. So when you're addressing this issue from a more general standpoint, you have to think about other things. So for instance, is the tax structure in the country very regressive? Does it fall more on the poor than it does on the rich? Do you need then to do something that addresses that issue? And, you know, other policies of the sort. And Brazil has a host of these problems that need to be addressed, none of which are really getting the recognition that they need to get.
Gilson, what is your view on that? You know, Bolsa Familia may address short-term needs for families, but what, if anything, does it do for longer-term needs?
Well, we have just seen the Oscar ceremony, and it's amazing that a Korean film was awarded the Oscar for Best Film. And it's interesting, I think that everyone is aware, the title, if those who haven't watched this film yet, but also, we are all aware of this word, parasite. I think that this is something that must be addressed not only in Brazil, but all over the world. What is a parasite? What is an economic parasite? Why don't we touch the rights and the policies that affect the financial sector? What's been going on in Brazil for decades, even before, of course, Bolsonaro, but it was maintained during the Lula years. This tremendous income transference for the financial sector, for big banks, for this middle class that is basically exploiting rentism. I think these are structural problems that cannot be changed only by a focused managerial approach to poverty. We have to address industrial structure. There was never an agrarian reform in Brazil. Land property is highly concentrated. So, the structure of property, of land, of capital, the problems of productivity, which depend on a very high-level educational system, which has been abandoned in Brazil. Yeah. All these are factors that would affect the long-term perspective of reducing poverty and inequality.
So, Gilson, let me get some clarity.
The government will continue to sustain the parasites.
All right, let me get some clarity on something that you're saying. Yeah, you said it again now. Are you calling the recipients of Bolsa Familia parasites?
No, I'm saying that the financial sector is a parasite because the financial sector and the owners of large portions of land in Brazil, these are all rentists. They are living out of rents. Yeah. And this is one major factor that contributes to income concentration and inequality. So the fact that you have a state that manages a focused, targeted, compensating policy does not affect the structural issues of a country that abolished slavery only about 100 years ago and left all the black population totally at a loss. So if you want to target, please target the financial sector or do an agrarian reform or tax heritage. We have just seen that these issues, even from the time of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, they have never been tackled properly. Why? Because they prefer to manage the situation, keep the Brazilian economic growth model as it is, concentrated, centralized, accumulating power by an elite, and they will play between the poor and the middle class, transferring here and there and trying to adapt. When the growth rate goes down, then you see that all the structural problems come out, and you see the concentration of power among an economic elite, which is parasite, because it's living out of income from interest rates and from rents, especially in the real estate sector, and there's large concentration of land in Brazil.
Marcelo, we've only got a minute left, but I'd like to get your view on this. Does this program, Bolsa Familia, need a lot more reform than those reforms that are being considered right now?
I think it needs some adjustment. Think of a Bolsa Familia 2.0. I think it's healthy, and but I think there is a risk of making the program worse because it's a good program. But I would favor something more like a middle path. I think we need. If we try to do if we try to do a revolution, I think everyone will suffer. And I think we need, to have good social policy, but sound economic policy as well. So I think it's not a choice of one for the other. I think we have to think about the Brazilian poor in a special way.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Well, that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.